The home that had saved him from a tyrant father turned into his tin coffin in the middle of a dense forest in a single second. Elias lay rigid on the narrow mattress in the back of the Ford Econoline, his breath hitching in his throat like a trapped bird. The darkness inside the van was absolute, save for the faint, ghostly glow of the moon filtering through the heavy blackout curtains he had meticulously sewn himself. For 12 years, this space had been his sanctuary. It was a rolling fortress, a steel membrane that separated him from a world he did not trust, and more importantly, from the memories of a childhood home where the sound of a key in the lock meant pain was coming. But tonight, the silence of the Appalachian mountains felt heavy, pressing against the metal walls with a physical weight. He had parked off a logging road in West Virginia, miles from the nearest paved highway. It was the kind of isolation he craved, the kind that usually brought his heart rate down to a resting hum. But the tranquility had shattered 20 minutes ago. It started with a sound. A car engine, distinct and sickly, whistling with a mechanical wheeze, likely a loose belt or a dying exhaust manifold. It had passed him once, crawling at a predatory pace, and Elias had paused his breathing, his hand hovering over his phone. He had told himself it was just a local, maybe a drunk taking a shortcut. But then the sound had returned. The whistling grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of gravel under heavy tires. The vehicle was not passing this time. It was turning in. Elias felt the old, familiar chemical spike of adrenaline. The same bitter taste that used to flood his mouth when his father's heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway. He sat up, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the bed. Logic warred with instinct. Start the engine, his gut screamed. Turn the key, flood the engine with gas, and tear out of here. But the van was old. It would cough, sputter, and roar before it moved. If he started it now, he would reveal his position instantly. If they were just curious teenagers looking for a place to drink, starting the engine might provoke them. Silence had been his shield as a boy. If he was quiet enough, if he made himself small enough, the monster in the living room might pass his door. The headlights of the intruder swept across the van's exterior, bright beams cutting through the gaps in the curtains, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Elias squeezed his eyes shut. Do not move. Do not breathe. The other vehicle killed its engine. The whistling died, replaced by the ticking of cooling metal and the overwhelming silence of the woods. Elias had a choice. He could burst into the front seat, key the ignition, and try to ram past them. It was risky. The trail was narrow, and he did not know if he was blocked in. Or he could wait. He could trust the lock on the back doors, trust the blackout curtains, and trust that if he remained a ghost, they would eventually lose interest and leave. It was the choice of a traumatized child, not a grown man, but the neural pathways of fear were deep and well-worn. He chose the silence. He chose the coffin. Then came the sound of a door opening. Then another. Heavy boots hit the gravel. Not one person. Not two. For distinct sets of footsteps crunched on the earth, moving with purpose. They were not talking, they were not laughing like teenagers. They were fanning out. Elias reached for the small paring knife he kept in the fruit netting, his hand trembling. The footsteps stopped right outside the sliding door. A handle was tried, locked. Elias did not exhale. Then, a voice, low and gravelly, drifted through the thin steel. Looks like a sleeper. The words hung in the cold air, terrifying in their casualness. They did not sound curious. They sounded appraising. Elias shrank back against the rear doors, pulling his knees to his chest, making himself as small as possible. He was 18 again, hiding in the closet, praying the shadow under the door would not stop. He waited for the smash of a window, the shout of police, or the drunken holler of locals messing with a tourist. Instead, he heard a sound that was infinitely worse because of its cold precision. Hiss. It was a sharp, aggressive release of air. Then another. Hiss. Then two more in rapid succession. The van listed slightly to the left, settling awkwardly into the mud. They were slashing the tires. The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. This was not a prank. You do not slash tires if you just want to scare someone off. You slash tires to keep them there. You slash tires to make sure the animal in the trap does not chew its leg off. His choice to stay silent had been the wrong one. The van was no longer a fortress. It was a cage, and he had just watched the key turn in the lock from the inside. Dark all round, a second voice said. Closer to the front cabin now. Check the cab. A beam of light played violently against the front windshield, trying to pierce the privacy curtain separating the driver's seat from the living area. Elias gripped the knife so hard the handle bit into his palm. He was trapped. If he moved to the front now, he'd be a silhouette against the light. If he stayed in the back, he was waiting to be shucked like an oyster. The helplessness was suffocating. It brought back the smell of whiskey and stale tobacco, the feeling of bruising fingers on his arm. He had spent 12 years driving away from that feeling, building a life of independence on 4 wheels, convincing himself he was free. But he realized now, shivering in the dark, that he had not been running toward freedom. He had just been building a smaller, mobile version of his childhood closet. Open it, the first voice commanded. No urgency, just a flat order. The sound of metal on metal scraped against the side door. They were using a crowbar. The van groaned, the frame shuddering under the assault. Elias looked at the lock mechanism. The pin was vibrating. It would not hold. The old Ford was tough, but it was not built to withstand a siege. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through his paralysis. He could not stay here. If they opened that door, he was cornered. He had to change the equation. He scrambled silently toward the driver's seat, keeping below the window line. His plan was desperate. Maybe he could still crank the engine, drive on the rims, grind his way out of this hell. He reached the front, his hand trembling as it found the ignition. But through the side window he saw a shadow move. One of the men was standing right by the driver's door, a silhouette against the trees. He was holding something long and tapered. A baseball bat? No, it was a machete. Elias pulled his hand back as if burned. He could not drive. He could not fight. The crowbar shrieked again, tearing through the metal skin of the sliding door. A gap appeared, a sliver of moonlight slicing into his sanctuary. Got it? A voice grunted. Get the zip ties ready. Zip ties. The word severed the last tether to his denial. This was not robbery. They did not want his laptop or his solar panels. They wanted him. The terror that washed over him was total, a drowning wave, but beneath it, a tiny, feral spark of survival ignited. The sliding door groaned, the metal screeching in protest as it was wrenched halfway open. The mechanism jammed, stuck on the bent frame. It was the only stroke of luck Elias had been granted all night. The gap was wide enough for a man to squeeze through, but not wide enough to rush him. A flashlight beam cut into the living space, blindingly bright, sweeping over the unmade bed, the small kitchenette, the books scattered on the floor. Empty? The man with the light muttered, sounding confused. Elias was pressed flat into the narrow footwell of the passenger seat in the front cab. Hidden by the hanging partition curtain he had partially drawn. He was holding his breath until his lungs burned. Check under the bed. Yes, gotta be in there. Engine's still warm. The leader growled. The man with the light leaned his upper body into the van, thrusting the beam toward the back. The other 2 men crowded behind him, their attention focused entirely on the rear of the vehicle. It was now or never. Elias did not think. He did not calculate. He acted on pure animal instinct. While their eyes were fixed on the bed, he unlocked the passenger door. He did not open it slowly. He threw it open and rolled out, hitting the wet gravel with a thud that sounded like a gunshot to his own ears. Hey! A shout erupted from the other side of the van. Elias did not look back. He scrambled up the embankment, his boots slipping on wet leaves and loose shale. He threw himself over a ridge and into the thick brush, the branches whipping his face, tearing at his clothes. Runner. Yes, a runner. The voice was filled with a chilling excitement. Elias did not stop until he reached the cover of a dense thicket of rhododendrons about 50 yards up the slope. He collapsed into the mud, his chest heaving, clamping a hand over his mouth to stifle the noise of his own gasping breath. From his vantage point, he could look down at the road. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. The men were not looting the van. They were not taking his gear. They had pulled huge duffel bags from their trunk. One man was holding a high-powered thermal monocular, scanning the tree line. Another was unrolling a tarp on the ground next to the van, arranging tools with methodical precision. A bone saw, heavy-duty tape, a coil of rope. It was a kill kit. They were prepared for this. They expected him to run. The man with the thermal scope lowered it and pointed directly up the slope, toward the rock formation Elias was hiding behind. Heat signature. 11 o'clock. 80 yards, the man said calmly. Elias watched as the four men adjusted their gear. They did not rush. They moved with the synchronized discipline of a paramilitary unit. They split into pairs, flanking the hill. The twist in his gut was nauseating. He had thought he was unlucky, a victim of random crime. But as he watched them move, he realized the truth was far darker. They were hunting. And by parking in this spot, by isolating himself from the world to feel safe, he had served himself up on a silver platter. The van had not been a shield. It had been a beacon. Elias moved. He did not run blindly this time, he crawled. He knew the thermal scope could see his heat, so he slid into the icy creek that ran parallel to the road. The freezing water shocked his system, numbing his limbs, but he knew it would mask his thermal signature. He dragged himself upstream, shivering violently, teeth gritted against the chatter. He spent the night like that, a creature of the mud, submerged in freezing water, moving only when the wind gusted to cover the sound. He could hear them calling to each other in the woods, whistling that same tune the car had made. They were playing with him, but as the hours dragged on, something shifted in Elias. The paralyzing fear of the child began to harden into a cold, jagged anger. He listened to their footsteps, heavy and arrogant. They were loud because they were not afraid. They thought he was weak. They thought he was just a rabbit. He survived the night not by hiding, but by enduring. He matched his breathing to the rhythm of the wind. He parted the mountain in a way he never had inside his van. Dawn broke gray and bleak. The men, realizing the sun would bring exposure, finally retreated. Elias watched from a ridge as they packed their gear, looking frustrated but not panicked. They threw a flare into the open door of his van before they left. He watched his home burn. He watched the flames lick up the curtains he had sewn, consuming the mattress where he had spent nights dreaming of safety. He did not cry. He waited another 2 hours after their car disappeared before stumbling down to the main road. He was hypothermic, covered in mud, and bleeding from a dozen cuts. A logging truck finally stopped for him. The driver, a heavy-set man with kind eyes, listened to Elias's fragmented story. He did not look surprised. 15 years ago, the driver said quietly, staring at the road ahead, couple went missing in that same spot. Police found their van burned out. Never found them. Folks round here say it happens every few years. Like a cycle. Like a harvest. The police took Elias back to the scene. The van was a blackened skeleton. The fire had taken everything, his clothes, his books, his journals. Elias stood before the wreckage, the smell of burnt rubber and melted plastic filling his nose. An officer was talking to him, asking if he had anyone he could call, anywhere he could go. Elias looked at the charred remains of the metal box he had spent his adult life living in. He thought about the lock on the door that had not held. He thought about the silence he had cherished, which had nearly killed him. He realized that his father's violence had taught him to hide, to make himself invisible, to build walls. And he had spent 12 years perfecting that isolation, thinking it was strength. But out there in the creek, shivering in the dark, he had survived because he fought, because he moved, because he refused to just stay in the box and wait for the end. "Sir?" the officer asked. "Do you have a place to stay?" Elias turned away from the ruin of the van. He looked at the open road, leading back toward the towns, the cities, the noise, and the people. The scary, messy, loud world he had been running from. "No," Elias said, his voice raspy but steady. "But I'm going to find one. A real one." He would not rebuild the van. He would not hide in the woods anymore. The hunters were still out there, somewhere in the dark, waiting for the next person trying to disappear. But they would not find Elias. He was done being a ghost. He was ready to be a man who lived in the light, where the monsters could not drag him away without a fight.